Welcome, everyone, to our third chat. These Fireside by the Data Visualization Society. We're a global professional association for data visualization folks from around the world with members from over 130 different countries. I'm guessing that a lot of you are here because you're DVS members, but if you're not, we'd love to have you join us. You can find more information on datavisualizationsociety.com. Today, we are talking about maps, and maybe maps, what's left to talk about. Maps have been at the forefront of a lot of the conversations about COVID-19 and how we understand what's happening with the coronavirus, but they are also a tool that we use to understand and analyze information throughout our day-to-day lives and in our businesses and in our other work. And so we're excited to have here today a group of experts just that we look at information geographically, the nuances and trade-offs of different kinds of maps, and hopefully give you some tips and tricks that you can use if you're doing mapping in your own work. I'm Amanda McCulloch. I work actually full-time as a firm that does technology consulting across software development, agile, and data and analytics. I also am the operations director for the Data Viz Society in my free time, I guess. And I want to give a big thanks to Excella for being willing to lend us their Zoom webinar license so that we can have these kind of big events. Free Zoom doesn't let you have this many people, and we've seen, looks like 368 people pile in so far. So we're really grateful to Excella for being willing to let us borrow this piece of software so we can share this information with you. The recording will be available at the end of this session, about actually 24 to 48 hours after, on our website on the Fireside Chat session, where you can also find other previous recordings of our other DVS Fireside Chats. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alberto to talk about and lead us off with maps. What's left to talk about? Thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you, Amanda. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to see you all here. I'm going to share my screen as well. I have the same. How do I slide format view? I need to present. Perfect. So I should be presenting now. So yeah, well, thank you to the Data Visualization Society for organizing this a fireside chat. I think that, or I don't think that it will be surprising if I say that I think that the coronavirus crisis is the first widely visualized crisis in the history of news, at least, right? I think that having being someone who has explored the history of data visualization and infographics in the news, both as a professor and also as a practitioner, as a journalist myself, I think that it's safe to say that coronavirus, the coverage of coronavirus visualization is central to it, beginning with, the famous flatten the curve diagram that has appeared everywhere, right? I tweeted about it a while ago that Brian Stelter from CNN described, the potential threat that coronavirus may pose more than a month ago, using this graphic as a background and describing how to read it, right? Not only that, but media organizations nowadays are publishing more and more data visualizations, and some of them have become extremely popular. So a while ago, the Washington Post published this great story about how an epidemic happens, right? And how a virus like coronavirus spreads over a population. It's a simulation of how a virus spreads, titled Why Outbreaks Like Coronavirus Spread Exponentially. And this visualization-driven story has become the most popular story ever published by the Washington Post online, which really shows, in my opinion, that the public in general really likes to see information visualized and numbers visualized, presenting through graphs, through maps, etc. And we're here to talk about maps, right? Because maps have a central role to play. But I would also like to talk a little bit about visual explanations, because people, for example, such as Our World in Data, in collaboration with other organizations, have been putting out visual explanations of how the virus operates, not data visualizations, right? These are not presentations that encode any data, but visual explanations of how the virus works, right? How it affects the body, how and why it is so contagious, and so on and so forth. So overall, I think, again, the coverage of coronavirus is being covered both through data visualizations and also visual explanations, and finally through maps, right? I guess that all of us are consulting, maps and dashboards, such as the famous Johns Hopkins University dashboards every day just to see the number of confirmed cases in different countries, the number of casualties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also see the media organizations such as the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and even local organizations such as, for example, the Miami Herald here in Miami. I live in Miami, Florida, as many of you know. The Miami Herald is doing a great job at covering the local impact of coronavirus. That's my dog in the background, by the way. So the New York Times, for instance, has been publishing plenty of maps about coronavirus all over the United States, sometimes using proportional symbols, bubbles, sometimes using triangles, like in this case, worldwide, United States-based, and so on and so forth. Other organizations have been experimenting with a more unusual or more unique types of maps, such as this one, which is sort of like an array, right? A lattice chart of like combining the graphics to form some sort of cartogram, graphics that show through different colors the number of cases all over the world. In any case, when I was preparing for this chart, for the conversation today, and I will say where the conversation comes from in just 1 minute, this conversation is based, it's actually related to an interest that I have had for quite a while, which is that as a non-map maker, as someone who is not a professional cartographer, but just a journalist who happens to be interested in data visualization and mapping as an extension of that, I have always wondered whether we don't overlook maps in the literature about data visualization, and that includes my own books, right? Only one of my books actually covers maps with any sort of depth. My second book has a chapter, just one chapter about maps. Is that nearly enough? I don't think so. And I think that as a consequence of that, maps are often overlooked and they are not as well understood by data visualization professionals as other kinds of visual displays of information, such as graphs or diagrams or networks and so on and so forth. So the question that drives this discussion with our three panelists today is driven by this idea. Can we do better? And what can we do to do better? What kinds of tips, what kinds of teachings, what kinds of things that we can look for or look into to become better map makers, and as a result of that, to become a better visualization designer as an extension of that. Anyway, just one last word before I give the word to our three panelists today. This discussion all began because I saw some tweets by mainly Elijah and Ken Field, to our panelists today, who were discussing about the relative virtues of different types of maps, and someone suggested that perhaps I may want to sort of like moderate the discussion between Madison, Elijah, and Ken about all these issues. And when someone proposed me as the moderator, I said that the only thing that I wanted to do was to read the question and answers from all of you participating in the discussion today. So please put your questions in the Q&A section, and that I will just, observe the discussion from the sidelines while enjoying a beer, which I have on my hand right now over here. Anyway, so our three panelists today are Madison, Draper, Elijah Meeks, and Kenneth Field. And perhaps, we can keep this informal. The first thing that I would like to begin with, perhaps, is to ask our three panelists today, maybe beginning with Madison, to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what you do, where you work for, and so on and so forth. And one last thing, after you introduce yourselves, I would ask you, and this is just my personal request, because I'm super interested in gathering examples of great maps. So tell us about, the most recent interesting or inspiring map that you have seen. If it is coronavirus related, that's better, but it doesn't need to be related to coronavirus. So welcome everyone, thank you for being here. Madison, welcome.
Hello everyone, I'll keep this brief because I know you really want to hear us go head to head. So my name is Madison Draper. I am in San Francisco, California, and I work for a company called Mapbox. We make maps, and we offer a bunch of other location-based services. And gosh, what was the other question? Was it just my favorite map?
That you choose one map. Yes, just one map that you have seen recently. If you don't remember any, that's fine. But I thought that it would be fun just for the three panelists to discuss a map that you have really liked recently.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I have to just say this map because it's on my wall and it's quite large and I see it every single day. This is the RISE map. It's a geomorphology map of the United States from like the 1900s. I don't know if it's my favorite map, but I had to memorize it when I was in school, so I know it quite well. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. Welcome. Elijah, you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm Elijah Meeks. I'm currently at Apple. I'm a data visualization engineer, and I got started in data visualization through GIS. So earlier on in my career, I did a lot more mapping and map-related stuff. I helped build the digital gazetteer of the Song Dynasty and a project called Orbis at Stanford and a bunch of different maps. In fact, while I was at Stanford, I decided I was going to write a mapping library. So I wrote something called D3Geo, which did all sorts of like sort of on-the-fly raster reprojection and automatic hex binning and stuff like that. And I think that's in sharp contrast to what happened to me later in my career, which is mostly doing more traditional data visualization. I've done some map work that hasn't seen too much out in the world, but for the most part, I haven't been nearly as involved with making maps as I was in my earlier career. I'd say for me, the most interesting map I've seen recently, Alberto, you had on your slides, it was the triangle map. I love those triangle maps.
Let me
Sure.
bring it back if you want to
Absolutely.
talk about it. So let me just go back to the slide. It's the New York Times one, right?
That's right.
The New York Times. I have it here. Give me just 1 second. Share my screen. Where is it? Here. Share screen. Here, so you can talk about it. There you go.
Excellent. Yeah, so I really enjoyed this style of map. I like this particular map itself because the New York Times has typically really good cartography. So it's very clean and beautiful. But I love this style of map. I think that when we talk about symbols and proportional symbols, we tend to think of proportional symbols as being circles. This is a proportional symbol, except it's triangles. And you know, I built a map that was somewhat similar to this. While I was at Netflix, I used the same principle to make the triangles. It's a really interesting process, and you have to take into account like sort of the draw order, so that you make sure to draw it so that the things that are higher up are actually drawn behind the things that are forward. So there's little things like that. And anyway, so I love this map, and not many of the other ones that I've seen lately, which is my brand. So we'll get into that later.
Okay, thank you. Ken?
Hi, everyone. Well, firstly, thanks for inviting me. I mean, you actually got me when you said bring a beer, so I thought I'd bring a beer. Cheers. I'm Ken. I'm a sort of an ex-academic. I spent a couple of decades in the UK teaching students about map design at various universities, and then I decided to take the plunge and go to the corporate world. So I now work at ESRI in sunny Southern California. I make maps, I talk about maps, I write about maps, I teach about maps. I'm basically an academic at ESRI without students to worry about. Although that said, we started our 4th iteration of our MOOC today, and there's something like 23,000 people around the world currently just playing around with fundamentals of mapping, which is phenomenal. Okay, a map that I like. Let me try and share my screen. And okay, let's go with that. Can you see that?
We can't. The share button is the green button at the bottom of the interface.
Yeah, that's what I was hitting. Ah, there we go. Let's try that one there.
Yeah, now it's working.
So I like this. This sort of popped up on my social media feed, and maybe a week or 10 days ago by Mathew Regis, and I apologize if I pronounced his name incorrectly, but a lot of the conversations in the last few weeks have been around the value of maps in this pandemic, and I've seen a lot of really great charts and maybe not so many great maps. There's a few, and I think we'll touch on them. But I love the fact that this takes a fairly old technique, which is just combining charts on maps, and does a really nice, clean job of it. And there's an animated version as well that he made, because it shows the where, and it also shows the trends in the data at the same time. And this is a really difficult thing to put on a map all at the same time. I guess in some respects, it's actually very similar to the map that Elijah just showed, except instead of a daily snapshot, we're seeing some sort of temporal dimension as well. And I thought this was a really neat modern take on combining charts and graphs. And if you'll indulge me, I do have one other favorite, which is my good friend and colleague, John Nelson, is very want to create all sorts of interesting, unique map styles, and he's just put together this beautiful little style that's a cross stitch. Now, I mean, it's practically useless for pretty much any mapping activity, but it's beautiful. And you know, in a time like this, maybe people just want to sit and play with something a little bit different, and maybe get the kids to make a map as well. So I thought that was
Completely agree. We need to try to keep the kids entertained and keep ourselves also distracted, right?
Yeah. So so there are my two little maps. Okay, but thanks for inviting me. This is gonna be fun.
Sure. Well, welcome to the three of you, and thank you for being here. And I mean, we can discuss. We can just take this wherever you want. If you want to participate or say something about one of the maps that the others are showing. For example, I like that sparkline map myself, but I always wonder, isn't there too much overlap in there? Don't the lines overlap too much? And can we really see location in there in comparison to our traditional proportional symbol map, or in comparison to the triangle map, and so on and so forth? But that's the kind of question that I would like to see rise in this conversation. In any case, I'm going to start just reading the questions from people who are attending the webinar today. So the first question that we got is from Sarah Cohen. And Sarah says that this might be off topic, which I don't think so. I think that is very on topic, because she asks, essentially, why a map? Why should we use a map at all? It's like, is a map always appropriate? I'm working on a project where a map is definitely the wrong way to look at county level data. And how many times, as a designer and as a journalist myself, have I found myself in the situation in which I'm working in the newsroom and a journalist comes to me and saying, we have this big story, our data set contains a geographic variable, let's do a map. Why a map? So it's like, why isn't there other ways to represent the data? So what I would like to ask the three of you is perhaps to do sort of like a quick overview, perhaps, of how you decide whether something should be a map or should be a completely different type of visualization. What are the reasons that may lead you to make a map versus other types of visualization? So who wants to take this one? Madison, perhaps? I mean, I don't mind, whoever.
Yeah, sure. I can go first. I mean, that is really a fantastic question. Like, creating a map takes a lot of effort too. Like, that's a very important part to remember, especially if you're working kind of in the journalism sector and like you have those tight deadlines. Making a map it's not trivial. Making a good map is certainly not an easy task, as I think all of us here can attest to. So I think of myself much more as a geographer than I do as a cartographer. It's actually kind of rare for me to make like a data viz related map. So I would honestly just kind of take a step back before you figure out kind of like what tool you're going to use and like how you want to represent something. Figure out why you're doing it first. And you do bring up a really good point in the example you put up for like the specific data and the per capita arrest rates for juveniles. Like, is this really the best way to represent it? Like, what is the story that you're trying to tell? What is the message that you want readers and viewers of the map to kind of like walk away with? Because they're not going to remember the data exactly. They're not going to remember exactly what the map looks like, but they're going to remember kind of like the narrative that you put around it. So that's kind of my take in a bit more of a conceptual view, and I'm sure the others have some more technical answers.
Yeah, it's all about purpose, right? It's like, as we always say, when I teach my young students, I always encourage them to say, to think about this way. It's like, don't just rush to the computer and start visualizing things, right? First of all, ask yourself, what is this for? And because a visualization is a tool, right? It's like a pair of glasses, right? The pair of glasses has a certain shape just because it is supposed to enable certain tasks. And visualization is not that different in that sense, right? Anyway, Elijah, Ken, do you want to contribute to that, or have any other
yeah, I think that ultimately it's a question everybody should ask themselves before they make a map. And I agree with what Madison was saying, which is making a good map is very hard. And I think that one of the challenges that we deal with now is that, like almost all data visualization, making a simple map is actually quite easy now, right? Anybody can drop a bunch of points into a CSV and put it onto a Google map pretty quickly nowadays. And so because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that when we think about maps fundamentally are geographic perspectives. And if we're looking at phenomena that tracks geographically, then it makes sense. If the pattern is something that exists in sort of space where the spread of things happens because of proximity and all of that stuff, then maps make sense. But for instance, if New York is closer to another big city, because people are mostly traveling through airlines, than it is to the rest of the state of New York, then when you put that stuff on a map, then it isn't necessarily true. I'm not trying to focus specifically on COVID-19, because COVID-19 has, has characteristics of spread from both sides of that. You see local spread and you see international spread. But I see a lot of maps where the connections really are between, are more of a network, where it's connections between major transportation hubs and major population centers where groups of people are moving back and forth. And they put them on a map, and then, for instance, you'll see them connected by lines, big swooping lines. And what it does is it creates this tremendously cluttered map, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to connect these geographically disparate points in space with the sort of network connections that connect them, right? A flight from New York to London is not so long as a drive from New York to Baltimore or wherever. I'm afraid I don't know the East Coast, so bear with me as I ruin my geography there. I'm reminded of a geography conference I went to at one point, which was held in Fargo. And it was decided to be held in Fargo because it was at the Geographic Center of North America. And it was at the Geographic Center physically, but to get there, I had to get onto one plane and then to a smaller plane and then to a smaller plane. And it took forever to get there. And so from a certain sense, it was very far from the rest of the country. And what we do implicitly, as Madison was saying, when we put it on a map, we imply that that distance is a first order principle of whatever it is the phenomenon we're looking at needs to be expressed. And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes it's not. And I think that more than anything else needs to be kept in mind.
That's great. Shall we, Ken, do you want to
yeah, I was
add
just,
something?
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to back Madison and Elijah up there. I think the key thing for me is I think we all default to what we're most experienced in. So, for me, it might be, oh, how can I map this? And for somebody else, it might be, how can I chart this? And, it's incumbent on all of us to sit back and think, well, is what we're defaulting to the best mechanism as well? And I've certainly looked at, some of the maps that have been going around over the last few weeks. And I understand why people are doing it. We're in anxious times and people want data to help make sense of what's going on. And the data is easily accessible. So people are going to use the characteristics of that data to do what they can with it. And the big characteristic of most data sets is it's got a latitude and a longitude. So you can put it on a map. So that becomes a very, very easy mechanism to create or be creative. Yeah, Elijah's right. Should we map it? And that's a sort of a more philosophical question, I guess, but I understand why people are doing it. And for me, sitting back, even as an experienced map maker, it's sitting back and thinking with a piece of paper and a pen, sketching things out. Is this going to work? What am I trying to say? Am I just mapping this for the heck of it? Am I, really revealing something new? Or perhaps this map already exists and maybe I'd be better just letting that map live rather than try to usurp it with something else. But, people are going to make maps. People like looking at maps and then now finding it very easy to make maps. And that's a good thing in general. But the ability to be to show a little bit of restraint, I think is also a very, very crucial characteristic of people who make good visualizations. You can see that restraint and that care that they're putting into the thought process. As Madison said, it's difficult making a good map as it is a good infographic or a good data viz. These aren't things that just naturally fall out of the sky. So, yeah.
I'm going to intervene there and sort of like build upon what the three of you have said, which is that there is something about maps that makes maps much more sort of like intuitively attractive than abstract data visualizations, right? I mean, I got into data visualization and infographics because of maps, and not maps that were created by professional cartographers, but maps that were designed by board game designers and role-playing game designers. So someone mentioned RPGs over here. I used to play role-playing games in college. I still play them today, and board games and things like that. And I absolutely love maps. Even if a map is completely useless, the mere presence of a map in any sort of document makes the document more attractive. So there is certainly an aesthetic component and an aesthetic function that maps also have. It's not just the information that they deliver, but how much they attract the people's attention to the message that you are trying to deliver. But there is something that you mentioned, Kate, that I think that may lead to the next question that people are posing, which is related to restraint. You mentioned the word restraint, and we have one question over here, which is, what role do you think that amateur map makers, so those who are not affiliated with health organizations, who are not professional map makers or professional epidemiologists or virologists or biostatisticians and so on and so forth, have in creating visualizations of this current global health crisis? Do you think that it is irresponsible to create content now if you're an expert, or do you have an editor that can help you sort of like navigate these waters? What kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to sort of like contribute to the public discussion, but without misleading the public with maps that are not correctly designed? What do you think about that?
Can I jump in first? I think it depends where you construe as an expert, right? I mean, it would be wonderful if all of the maps that came out of the CDC and the WHO and various other health agencies were great maps, but they're not. You know, they're not. These people are epidemiologists and other types of expertise, and making a map isn't necessarily their forte either. So to me, it's about collaboration. And, you know, cartographers happen to have this extremely small but fairly unique niche of expertise. And collaborating with a cartographer is going to ramp your map up to the next level pretty quickly. So that for me is absolutely key. I don't have any problem with people experimenting and creating visualizations and maps. I think it's wonderful. Where maybe they might think about restraint is in just not hitting publish all the time. And, you know, I've seen maps get tens of thousands of hits on social media, and they're not the best things. No, it's not to say don't ever publish that, but maybe just get some eyes on that before you go ahead and share it. You know, get somebody to have a look at it. What does it say to them? You know, do they scowl at it or whatever it might be? But getting eyes on work is always important, and that goes the same for what you might call experts as well. So I would also remind people that, of course, some of the very, very best maps were made by non-cartographers anyway. I mean, Beck's London Underground, Nightingale's Coxcombs, Menard's Napoleon's March. I mean, I could go on. These are people that weren't trained cartographers, yet somehow some of the most charismatic and beautiful maps we've ever had.
I'd like to say that it'd be great if amateur map makers made challenging maps that were, I mean, in all of the examples Ken gives, right? These are people who wanted to show things, and maybe they didn't have a training in cartography, but they were challenging the form. And so if we saw a bunch of neo-geographers or amateur map makers, or however we describe it, making very strange maps, very interesting maps, right? Where they were playing with the concept of space or playing with the concept of representation. I'm very much in favor of that, even though many of them will be actively misleading, because if you don't have training, then that's typically what's going to happen. I'm okay with that because we need to see more forums. We need to have a more vibrant community. I think what I find difficult to apprehend is that they're all sort of the same bad maps oftentimes. Oftentimes it's a bunch of little, you know, Google Maps markers in a giant blob on a map of the United States on some slippy map, or likewise. And then I go back to this idea that that Kenneth just brought up, which is why make a new map when that map already exists? Why not just let the map the other map exist? And that it's hard for me to thread that needle, because it's not like you want to quash innovation. And I think we need as much as possible. We need a fertile community. But when people you know, you can see how much effort a person puts into a map or an organization puts into a map. And we don't need another like sort of simple, not very well thought out map of COVID or anything else. And I think that's the challenge is getting that message across without quashing anybody from making maps, because I think everyone should. I think it's good for all of us to see more, and because it makes us all more literate and sophisticated in how we apprehend them.
Madison, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, definitely. I think, of course, what Elijah and Kenneth had just said is fantastic. But I'm also quite curious on the side of what a professional cartographer is mapping, and kind of questioning like what kind of, also we should look at our own knowledge and see kind of like if what we're trying to map is something that we're knowledgeable enough about. And there are limitations. I am not a professional epidemiologist. Me trying to map out something of COVID, I could be completely wrong about it. And there are available data sets, but kind of looking through the metadata, like there's things that I don't know what they mean. I know that like 19 is a strain, but I don't know what that means or kind of what the other strains are. And kind of really recognizing our own limitations, whether you're on the side of the amateur or the professional or somewhere in between, really understanding what you're mapping, I think really just is at the core of it. And just because someone is more trained in cartography or in data visualization in a more broader sense, just kind of knowing what that data is and making sure you're representing it in a way that is kind of like actually the story that you want to tell with the data, I think is just another layer to add on top of that.
Great. Well, we have tons of questions, so I'm going to start prompting you all to move faster. So because we have a hard stop, half an hour from now, I think. Anyway, so the very quick question, very direct. What do you think that is the most underrated skill in the field? I guess that this question refers to the field of map making, cartography. What is the most underrated skill in the field?
Sketching out.
Sketching out.
Yeah. Doing rough work. Don't just
rough.
Throw the data on the map and expect it to work.
It seems that the three panelists agree. Elijah, Madison? Yeah, we have an agreement on that one. What is the role of interactivity? We have a question about interaction. So when is it appropriate to add interaction or not add interaction, and so on and so forth?
You can add interaction if it adds to the experience, but you cannot add interaction as an excuse not to encode something directly on the map because it's grown too cluttered, because most of your audience will not use the interaction. And basically what you're doing is you're just sort of sweeping your loose ends under the rug to completely butcher a metaphor.
Can you say that again? I'm going to write that down. That was great.
As an actual quote, stealing the quote for a future book.
Yeah.
I do that all the time.
No,
so,
Ken, you'll have to subscribe to our YouTube channel to get access to it. I'm sorry. That's how we...
And then ask for formal permission. You will need a form for that or something. All right, so we have one question that was answered by Kenneth, another one that was answered by Elijah. So I'm going to ask Madison perhaps there's another question about colors. I know that color is a huge thing in maps, right? But can you point out perhaps some key elementary resources that people who are interested in learning more about map making, people can consult to become better at choosing color palettes? Are there available sources out there that you could mention, like articles, books, websites, or something like that? You're muted. Sorry. It's quite confusing to mute and unmute ourselves.
Definitely. Sorry about that. I think amongst the mapping community, Color Brewer is quite popular, particularly for choropleth maps. And then kind of like thinking in more of like a broader design sense, if you want to make something else that just has like a very nice, like harmonious color palette. Adobe's tools are quite nice. Like the algorithms that they've set up do like make nice color palettes. I believe it's like color.adobe.com is a tool that I use quite frequently. You can also just kind of like put colors that you are interested in into Photoshop and put kind of like a transparent yellow overlay over them to kind of see how those kind of blend together and like pull a more harmonious palette. Yeah, thank you for putting the link for Color Brewer. those are good tools. Other design teams that have been kind of popping up in San Francisco make a lot of really great color tools. The first one that comes to mind is Lyft's Color Box. That's a great one to just kind of look at. So those are some tools.
That's great. We also have plenty of questions about, sorry, my dog is like barking like crazy in the background. We have plenty of questions about aggregation. We have tons of questions about the geographic subdivisions that we should use and we should not use. I'm going to try to aggregate all those questions together and begin to, for example, by talking about total counts versus relative measures, right? It's like total counts versus rates or percentages, right? The ongoing discussion between, choropleth maps and other types of maps that may be better at showing counts. So, for instance, why is it wrong to display total counts in a choropleth map? What is wrong about that? Because I have my doubts about that. I know that is sort of like what all cartographers suggest and recommend, but I have sort of like, I always question all these sort of like inherited rules, so to speak, and inherited traditions. So I want to learn more about myself. Why is it wrong to display total counts in a choropleth map? To begin with, we'll have other follow-up questions.
You might expect me to jump in here. Honestly, there's virtually no rules in cartography. There really isn't. There's some best practices, virtually no rules at all. I would advocate, if you know a little bit about some of the best practices, you know how best to break them as well. That helps. But the one rule that I always live by is you can't map totals on a choropleth, because the size of the area and the underlying population denominator affect your perception of the color that you're looking at in that area. So if you just map totals, let's say 10 is your maximum number, and you've got two areas, and you show 10 in one area and 10 in another, but area 1 has 100 people and area 2 has 1,000 people, but you show it with the same symbol, you're showing it as having a similar character. It's not. You've got a 1 in 10 chance of maybe bumping into another person with a case of COVID in area A, but only a 1 in 100 chance in area B. So what we're looking at with different shades of red or green or whatever it might be is intensity. And that's how our eyes and our brains perceive those different shades of color. It's intensity. It's not quantity. So we have that. And there's lots of other issues to do with modifiable aerial unit problems and different sizes of areas and all sorts of other stuff as well that we could go into. But that's basically the crux of it. But it's not saying that mapping totals isn't correct. It's just pick one of the other mapping techniques that do a great job in mapping totals. So totals are great for planning, right? We might want to know.
So let's talk about those, and then I'm going to switch the question to the other two panelists. So, yes. What are good ways to visualize counts if it is not a choropleth? Because there have also been some pushback against, for example, proportional symbol maps, bubble maps, right? Although not all proportional symbols use bubbles, bubble maps are the most common type of graduated symbols maps. So, what other ways are there to visualize totals, counts in a map?
So the key thing to remember is there is no perfect mapping technique anyway. If there was, we'd all be using it and the maps would all be great. So every single thematic mapping technique
Elijah, Madison,
has
do you want to, Can you suggest other types, Madison or Elijah, other types of maps? Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say dot density is a great technique. Cartograms are pretty useful, but of course they're a little bit like, people either love them or hate them. I think Elijah's peaks, the triangles, that's a great way of showing totals.
I mean, I think that dot density is, I think what we need critically is either mapping tools that do heat maps better, or people who can make them more easily. I think that the main reason why we see so many bubble maps isn't because people are choosing bubble maps out of their 10 maps to produce. I think a bubble map's a very easy map to make. You create a symbol on a map and you size it, hopefully using a square root scale based on some magnitude. And that's great when there's a few dozen dots on a map. There's a New York Times map about water usage that I used to trot out all the time and get angry at. where it's just a giant mass of circles on top of each other. And it's like, well, what do you get out of this? I asked about the, I think it was the Johns Hopkins map, or maybe it was one of the New York Times bubble maps. And I said, who gets things out of this? And somebody responded and said, well, I know not to go anywhere in the Northeast, right? Which is not what you should get out of it. Like the circle out of New York is not actually spread all over New England. It's fundamentally, that's bad. The problem is it's easy to make those. Whereas if you make a map based on dot density, it's not like you go and click the dot density function and it's one thing and it just makes a perfect map. You have to take into account the scale of the data. You have to take into account your sampling method, the kind of data that you've got, because there's different kinds of density maps that you create if your point is a sample versus if your point is an actual reported point. And so, you know, whether or not you draw a spline or you do a kernel density or things like that is extremely challenging. And I think, frankly, that it's more challenging to make than it is to read. I think a well-done heat map is actually eminently readable by audiences. And I think what's holding us back is that it's hard to make those, especially on deadlines for news organizations. But even just in general, I mean, the tools aren't, you know, there's those, yeah, I was going to start talking about ArcGIS and all the little red toolboxes, and they're right there. It's really easy in ArcGIS if if you've taken classes and you've done it, but you can't deploy those kind of maps either. Like the technology that we use for web mapping is not really great for deploying those kind of maps either. So it's like, it's not that I feel like people went out of their way to create a bad map when they're doing bubble maps. It's that I think that that's the most accessible form for them to create. It's just not the most accessible form for people to read.
Yeah, I'll jump in real fast to that. I completely agree with that. I worked as a support engineer at Mapbox for my first year, and there were some people just asking very simply how to put points on a map. That was probably our number one question. And a lot of times people haven't even considered the other types of maps they could be making just because they seemed too far out of reach. So I think that is definitely one reason. And then another thing I'd like to kind of think about is maps. Many of them aren't static, especially the ones that we're making today. And the kinds of maps that you're representing or like kind of different visualizations you're representing don't always work at all zoom levels. So being able to kind of like look at your data and see kind of like what it looks like at the different zoom levels, and also kind of like how it transitions as you move in and out of different scales, I think is very important. So the dot density maps are very powerful when you're kind of in like that closer up view and you kind of see the individual points. But when you're further out, it can be harder to distinguish. You do see the like intensities, but you're not really getting as much information as you would close up. So that might be a time when you would want to cluster them or use another type of visualization.
Madison's totally right there.
Sorry about that.
Well, I mean, I was thinking about this a few years ago, you know, when multi-scale web mapping started to become a real thing. And, you know, everyone's saying, oh, it's great. You know, you just publish your map and it's there. Actually, for me, it made the process of making a map more complex, because not only now are you having to make maybe 10 maps that all work at their own scale, but also have to work between scales. And yeah, when we're dealing with thematic maps and the symbology across those, it's really problematic and a tricky job. I think what we're all alluding to here is back to what somebody said at the start, that making a map isn't a trivial thing. It's a difficult thing. It's not something you can just magically do. And the only other thing I'd say though is I need to talk to Elijah about his web mapping in ArcGIS. I think things maybe have moved on a bit, but we can take that offline.
Making a map is not making just a mere drawing or a mere illustration, right? You're making a tool to help people understand stuff. So a related question about building the map themselves, a couple of questions that I have seen have to do with the geographic divisions or subdivisions that we use on a map. So why is it wrong, and I guess that many people have read articles about this, why is it wrong to use zip codes to visualize data? What is wrong with zip codes? Why shouldn't we use zip codes as a unit of like geographic subdivision in our data? If it is wrong at all, it may not be wrong. I don't know. I'm just asking the question.
Zip codes. There's a long article on this that I think in Carto. Zip codes don't match up with geographic areas, and they have uneven distribution, and in rural areas they can misidentify even the range that they cover. So zip codes weren't designed as units of governance or units for census or anything like that. I frankly think that even in spite of all of those things, the granularity of zip codes for most of the mapping projects that people use, I think the effect isn't as bad as some of these other things that people do. But I think what this highlights, Alberto, is another case where people are doing it because it's there, right? Because it's available. People aren't choosing zip codes over census tracts. It's not like somebody's made a design decision where they're like, am I going to use census tracts or zip codes or, you know, individual points or whatever? No, they're using it because the data came that way, and we have long points for zip codes. And I think that's the danger. And maybe to me, I guess I keep coming back to it. And so that's maybe the thing that I'd like to emphasize in this talk is that, to Ken's point, there's no wrong maps. Like there's no right, I shouldn't say that, there's a lot of wrong maps. There's no perfect like approach for every map that's the same approach, but you have to be more thoughtful about it. And just because something is there in front of you and it's convenient doesn't mean it's the best decision.
There are a couple of questions, by the way, related to these. I mean, the other two panelists can weigh in these answers if you want to, but there's a related question that I wanted to bring up immediately because it's related to how many of the bad choices or dubious choices, right, that we make whenever we design map are related to the constraints or the affordances of the tools that we use every day. Right? It's like you are using, you use a particular tool and that particular tool gives you these choices and you use just those choices or that color palette or that particular type of legend just because it's readily available rather than forcing the tool and hacking the tool to do what you want to do. So what is the responsibility in there or the interplay between all these factors?
Okay, I hear that a lot as well. And I don't buy it too much because I don't want to talk particularly about the software I'm involved with, but the amount you can do with it and the ability to take your map to the stratosphere is possible, and you can with many other mapping packages, and I really do think it comes back down to this idea of kind of thinking outside the box a little bit and thinking about what do you want your map to look like, which is why I talked about a bit of paper and a pen. And then it's simply a case of figuring out through what tools you have available to you, how do you get to that endpoint? And sure, along the way, you may come up against one or two constraints. You either then have to consciously decide whether you can accept them or you want to reject them and you have to find a different way around it. But I think there's enough in today's mapping products and in terms of blogs and white papers and tutorials and free videos of discussions and things that there's a lot of stuff out there that help people try to make a better map.
Yeah, I think kind of going off of that, a lot of my job at Mapbox has been to push our tools, to push our map design tool in particular, to really like fit either the customer's needs or do just something kind of cool that we haven't supported previously. And I personally don't work with our code bases. I don't change any of that. I just try and really make the visualization and I make the tool work for me rather than myself working the tool. And I think that is, that's important. I know in a lot of school classes, you learn kind of a bunch of various different tools, whether it's Carto or QGIS or what have it. But I think kind of like the tool you end up with is it's up to you, and like they have their own things that they can do and they can't do, and then it's kind of up to you and kind of like your mastery and your interest in that tool, in that discipline, and what you can do with it, not what it can and can't do. I think is very, very important, and kind of like what Kenneth was saying about like starting off with a pen and paper. That's where I start too, and I think yeah, I'm a complete broken record when I keep saying like the purpose of what you want to do is going to be the most important part of the map.
one related to what you are all saying, the three of you are saying, one of the advice that I give, one of the pieces of advice that I give to my students, and just anticipating the kind of feedback that they will get from me when they turn their projects in, is to tell them that as a former editor in newsrooms, I hate to be able to tell which tool was used to create a visualization. I really don't like that, because that really conveys that the visualization was not designed by a human being. And I want to talk to human beings, not to computers. So I want to have the sense that the designer actually put some work into making the visualization truly hers or his, right? Forcing the tool to sort of like do what the designer wants to do, not what the tool wants that designer to do, right? Or to make the map in the way that the tool dictates. It should be the designer making the choices. Anyway, so we have only 5 minutes until the end of the conversation today. So, and I'm sorry if I could not cover I tried to summarize many of these questions and sort of like merge them together to cover sort of like the main topics that I have seen popping up in the question and answers. So why don't we wrap it up by talking a little bit about literacy? Because there's a question here that really got my attention by Regis O'Connor, who says, I would love to hear the panelists discuss map literacy. I amazingly know many people who cannot read maps and have made a point in my personal network to help them understand the concept of maps. So the question that I have for you related to what Regis is writing about here is, do you know people who don't know how to read maps? And if that is, do you think that is a common phenomenon? And if that case, what could we do as a community? And I'm talking about, when I say community, I see like the Data Visualization Society, right? All the 400 people who are participating in the discussion here today. What can we contribute? What can we do to sort of like spread more knowledge of how to read not only maps, but data visualizations, right? My latest book is titled How Chats Lie, but it's really a book about how to better read data visualizations, just because I also identified this problem, not with maps, but with bar graphs, for instance. I saw people who cannot read a bar graph. So what can we all do? What would you recommend people to do in their personal lives or professional lives to sort of like have to sort of like push data literacy and make the data and map literacy a little bit more common than they are right now?
Okay, neither of the other two clicked their mic, so okay. I actually have a notion that this pandemic, you know, if we look back on it in a year or so's time, might be a turning point in improving people's ability to understand graphs and charts and maps a little bit, because I think it takes these kind of, I mean, well, we haven't really had something like this, but it takes these kind of events for people to turn their kind of natural curiosity into more of an inquisitive, you know, why am I being told the truth? What does this chart or map really say? And I think what's been really helpful is those charts and maps where people have added a small explanatory paragraph to help people interpret what it is they're seeing. And I think that's so crucial that we can't assume that the map is just going to do the job or the chart is just going to do the job, because you know, people come from many, many different backgrounds and many, many different educational levels and experiences, and they aren't all equal in their ability to consume information. And that's the other half of the equation, right? We can make the best map in the world, but if it's not consumed effectively, it's going to fail. So, you know, I have a sense that this is going to help considerably in bringing maps and charts and graphs more to the public fore.
I think you're right, Ken. And I think that what needs to happen, though, is we need to not just allow it to happen, but foster some kind of discussion and review that really embraces that. You know, oftentimes with generic data visualization and maps also, we never look back. Everything is a sort of ephemeral product thrown into our face, and then it just disappears. You occasionally have Manuel Lima or you, Alberto, go back and sort of review the best things that were made over the last 30 years. We should really, once, God willing, if this thing ever ends, once it does end, we should go back and say, well, who got it right and who maybe didn't get it right, and hold them up and say, we could have done better. You could have done better than this. We could have, you know, this was a particularly good one, and go through it, look at the products that were created during this period, and evaluate them and tell folks, next time you see something, look for things like this and watch out for things like that, and provide some kind of lessons learned from this. Like you said, Alberto, when you introduced this moment that was driven and almost defined by data visualization. For most of us, that's how we're experiencing COVID-19, is via data visualization. So if we embrace that and really do take this moment, I think that that could provide us with an opportunity to enhance literacy for the larger community.
When I told my dad that I was going to major in geography, he said, well, at least I know you'll never get lost. At least you'll be able to read a map. Or I'm paraphrasing, but that wasn't something I really considered when I started studying geography, and kind of thinking about what Elijah and Kenneth had just said, thinking that like what these representations that we're showing and displaying everyone, like these maps are creating a reality for people. And I think that's very, very important to think about for COVID, and also just for anything. Like there's a very high chance that I will never go to many of the places that I've ever mapped. But I'm creating this reality for myself, for other people who will view this map. And I am essentially saying that this is some sort of truth. And I think that's important to remember kind of about whatever sort of map that we're making, whether it be a base map or a visualization, that people are going to interpret that. For the most part, I'm sure many critical cartographers in here may not, but they will interpret that to be what reality is, and that's what's going on. And I think that's something that, this is a great point for us to kind of like conclude at, that that's what we're all trying to convey here, is that the map is real for a lot of people. And when visualizations are made that are not necessarily accurate of the reality, that's kind of when fear spikes, or when some other kind of emotion is being elicited. And yeah, so I think it's a very big responsibility, but it's also a great honor at some points too.
There's this old saying, and I'm going to just wrap up the conversation right now because we have a hard stop right now. This old saying, you know, the map is not the territory, right? Referring to the fact that maps are always abstractions. But we could append sort of like a second part of that sentence that was sort of like elicited in my brain, but because of what the three of you were saying, that the map is not the territory, but the map can create new mental territories. And those mental territories can be better or worse depending on how well we apply certain principles, certain rules, certain sort of like verification processes, and good color palettes, good typography, good color, good interaction principles to the designs of the things that we do every day. Anyway, so that's all for today. I would like to thank the three of you for being here. This has been great. I would also like to thank the around 400 people who have participated in the panel today for being here. I would encourage you to take a quick look at the chat window while we all say goodbye, because I have just seen people posting, links to resources and answering every other each other questions with articles and links, etc. So thank you so much for doing that. I think that knowledge doesn't belong or doesn't exist in individual brains. Knowledge is distributed. And I think that the Data Visualization Society and this Zoom conversation today really, really proves that point. Well, thank you for being here again. Thank you, Madison.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Elijah. And thank you, everyone else.